recording. So hello, bonjour. On behalf of the Center for Research on Educational Services and its director, Peter Milley, I would like to welcome you to this event on neurodiversity in research and innovation. Through CREX, we collaborate with community partners from various sectors, and we applied. That was not a very good sentence. We applied and inclusive research methods and evaluation. We also focus on the training of many of our students at the University of Ottawa to develop those competencies in inclusive and participatory research and evaluation methods and working with our community partners. Our vision is inclusive knowledge, better society. So we try our best to work collaboratively with community members to learn together on different topics. First, I would like to invite you to pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of the land where the University of Ottawa is located and which remain unceded. I pay respect to all Indigenous people who call Ottawa home. Personally, this land is important to me because since I immigrated to Canada, it's a land of growth and opportunity for me. So I am very grateful for the opportunities that this land has given me. And at CREX, we acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we feel privileged to learn from them and with them on many different projects. Je souhaite également accueillir chaleureusement les membres de la communauté francophone qui sont avec nous aujourd'hui. Cet événement se déroulera en anglais. Par contre, une de nos panélistes et moi-même, nous parlons en français, donc vous pouvez vous exprimer dans la langue de votre choix et nous nous assurerons de faire la traduction. So we are delighted to have you here to talk about neurodiversity in research and innovation. I am Virginie Cobigo. I'm associate professor at the School of Psychology at the Faculty of Social Sciences, University of Ottawa, and a CREX researcher. And I lead research to co-create solutions to improve the social inclusion of persons with a range of cognitive abilities and to improve the cognitive accessibility of our environment. And to support this research, I have created recently, about a year ago, an enterprise that is called Open Collaboration for Cognitive Accessibility, which you will hear about today. And through Open, we offer a range of services to organizations from the private sector, public sector, and not-for-profit to improve and test the cognitive accessibility of solutions, services, and the built environment. And we have been in activity for about a year, but we have already offered employment to about 30 individuals with a range of cognitive abilities. So I'm very proud of this achievement, and I could talk about it for an hour, but it's absolutely not the topic for today. I'd rather give the floor to three inspiring women. I have a chance to talk to each of them in the past and hear them talk about their passion and our common interests. So I'm very, very glad to be able to share with you their knowledge and perspective today. So we are welcoming Fatu Mataba. Fatu is a data support specialist at the University of Ottawa Library and also works with me. She's my close collaborator at Open Collaboration for Cognitive Accessibility. Her research interests lie in the cognitive accessibility of information and communication technologies. And with Open, she leads the testing of different technologies with advisors in cognitive accessibility who have a range of cognitive abilities. Fatu also uses her lived experience as a neurodiverse woman to inform and improve the accessibility of research methods and user testing methods. I also welcome Laura Gibbons, who's currently a senior human resources manager at Microsoft Canada. Laura has a strong focus in employee relations and manager training. She holds a Master of Business Administration from the University of Northern BC, and over a decade of experience as an HR professional. She is truly passionate about inclusive workplaces and will share with us some insight into the inclusive hiring program and other initiatives at Microsoft. And we also welcome Sharon Nyangweso. I hope I had said that right, Sharon. Who is the founder and CEO of QuakeLab. And QuakeLab is a full stack inclusion agency that uses human-centered design to help organizations move from aspiration to action in terms of their EDI, their equity, diversity, and inclusion. Sharon is a truly empathetic leader, a very passionate woman and very inspiring woman. And she immigrated from Kenya in 2010, and since then has worked in different organizations and in different roles, including social advocacy, innovation, community building, and since 2019, she leads QuakeLab. I really can't wait to hear from them today. But first, I would like to explain how we will proceed. So this is a panel discussion. So I have prepared a few questions that I will ask to our panelists. And I invite you, and as I said, the event is in English, but please interact with us in the language of your choice, and I will translate for you. And Fatu speaks French, so you can communicate with Fatu in the language of your choice as well. So I will ask a few questions to our panelists, but there will be time at the end to answer your questions. So please use the chat to write your questions and interact with the panelists. I will monitor the questions and ask them on your behalf at the end of our interaction. The microphones will be turned off or muted during the session. You have the opportunity to interact through the chat. Feel free to turn on or off your video. That is really your choice. And the event is recorded. It will be available on the CREX website, I guess, but at least social media, and Open will also share the recording on our Twitter account, LinkedIn, and Facebook accounts. So you have a chance to watch it again or share it with people who might have missed it. And we will record the period of time where I interact with the panelists, but not the questions after your questions after that. So we will stop the recording at that point, and you will be informed on your screen that the recording has been stopped. If it is your first time attending a CREX colloquium, please know that we try to organize at least once a month a colloquium of that sort on very different topics depending on the research and the evaluation projects that are led by CREX researchers and community partners. So now let's start our conversation on neurodiversity in research and innovation. If you don't mind, Sharon, I would like to start with you. And the first question that I would like to ask is, I know that with QuakeLab, you are supporting organizations in putting EDI from aspiration to action, as I said. How is neurodiversity usually approached in organizations? And what are the typical challenges for hiring and retaining a neurodiverse workforce?
Thank you, Virginie, and thank you everyone for being here. I truly appreciate you being here today. I understand that our time is so valuable, especially now. This is valuable real estate, especially midday when it's either up or down from here. So I appreciate your time and your participation here. I think that's both a big question, but also a really useful question to start with, particularly because in the space that I work in, we are often going into organizations that have existing policies, procedures, processes, and cultures. And what we find is similar to every aspect of EDI, although we like to really move with an intense level of specificity around who we are building for and what their specific challenges are. But across the board, something we find is this focus on the more intangible aspects of how to build in equity, how to build in accessibility, and how to support folks who are coming in from different intersections through their identity. And this level of moving away from the more tangible pieces. So you hear people talking about how do we make people feel like they belong, which is intensely important. How do we make people feel like they belong? But when the level of analysis around accessibility and equity stays in belonging, it really divorces an organization from the responsibility of being very specific and really thinking about what parts of our structures, our policies, our systems need to radically be altered in order for a person to move through or navigate through our organization and thrive. And then also, how do we need to ensure that we're being as flexible, as open as possible, and also building enough trust that a person can then say, these systems, are great overall, but these are my specific needs in order to, again, navigate the organization and thrive. And so where I'd like to maybe, if I can take a few seconds here, Virginie, let me know if I'm going over time. The way I like to think of it is to first start by really situating us in the ways that this inaccessibility can form itself into a structural or systemic challenge. So what we know, or this is a predominantly North American statistics, is I believe just over half of working age folks who are, have diagnosed with ADHD, with social anxiety alone, are either underemployed or completely unemployed. Now, when you think about something like that, when you're not talking about a comfort level, it immediately tells you that systemically there are structures that are missing. And we are starting from not even when a person is in an organization, but just the pathway takes to enter an organization. And again, this cannot be about, what do they, do we need to say, oh, do we need to provide, you'll hear a lot of organizations who say, oh, there's a problem, let's have pizza parties, let's, rather than really looking structurally at what parts of our systems create barriers to access and participation right from the beginning. And when you start to break it down like that, again, starting right from the point at which a person who may be neurodivergent is beginning to engage with your organizational systems around recruitment, for instance. So how do they come to know of you? Where are you advertising? Where are you looking for people? What are you advertising? How are you specifically making it known that this is who we are looking for? These are the ways in which we accommodate for their needs. And these are the systems we have available to ensure that you will thrive. And part of that, my apologies if you see me looking down, I'm a note taker at heart. And part of that is thinking about the interview process, the advertising, what negotiation looks like, what onboarding looks like. And again, identifying in every step of that system in which a person comes into contact with you, what are the barriers to access and participation? And also, what is forcing people to self-select out? Because we often only think about what are the ways in which we are selecting people without understanding that a really, really core aspect of equity is around, am I giving a person enough information to be able to be autonomous enough to say, this is where I want to be? And a big part of that is thinking, what are the ways in which I am making sure a person is self-selecting out of a process? And this is so critical because it is not something you can technically even account for using data, because you can't know who has seen your ad and decided, definitely not for me. There is no way to even, there are very few ways to actually collect that data. And so you have to be pretty pragmatic and strategic about it. Also worth noting is that once a person is already in a workforce, if they have overcome any existing barriers to then enter an organization to be in your space, you need to consider a really big issue that comes up when you're thinking about accessibility, which is the question of disclosure and the question of seeking accommodations. Again, this can be looked at both from a systems level, which is what you can do proactively, and then what you can do responsibly. So proactively really lives in that area of policies and procedures in the way you work. So for instance, when we talk about neurodiversity, and Virginie had asked around the challenges. A challenge is that when you're talking about neurodiversity, that key piece there is diversity. Folks who are fallen within this in this categorization, their needs, their desires, how they want to navigate a space looks so vastly different that you can't say we did this thing, so that should cover everyone who is neurodivergent. There's really no way in the world to be able to do that. However, from a systems level, you need to rely on existing data. You need to rely on existing knowledge to say, at a baseline, in terms of being proactive, what do we need to set in place? That is going to include, again, your policies and procedures. And when we talk about policies and procedures, we mean things like, from a systems level, what are the ways in which we are assessing performance? And how is this a barrier to upward mobility for someone who is neurodivergent? What are the ways in which we set expectations for ways you work, how you work, what you produce, what your deliverables are, and how is that creating a barrier to access and participation? So those are the ways in which you can be proactive. And then there's the ways of being reactive that also overlaps with systems, because have you created an environment through your systems, processes, but also culture in which it is not difficult to be able to A, disclose, and 2, seek particular specific accommodations to an individual's need, not as a whole. And so that means, for instance, at a very even basic level that we see often is how difficult it is to go through the process of seeking an accommodation from a policy and process level. We have worked with organizations that have written policies that, for instance, say you need to disclose to a manager, you need to disclose to HR, you need to disclose to all of these lists of people, you need to have at least 2 official diagnoses from at least 2 professionals to back up this diagnosis before you're even able to access accommodations. So that's why we say you need to start at a systems and structural level, because it's not just about what you say. When we talk about equity, we talk about 2 things. There's the work that is ad hoc, and there's the work that is embedded into process and systems. The ad hoc, although it can be well-meaning, means that any kind of equity building is dependent on an individual person, and it's dependent on me being in the seat and me being in control of everything. But what happens if I leave? Does that equity building also leave with me? And so it needs to be embedded in process, and part of that is policy. And then the reactive, again, is thinking through, okay, if I've created processes by which it is not a barrier to access accommodations, then it might mean someone saying, for me specifically, I also need X, Y, Z to be able to thrive. So I'll pause there.
Thank you very much, Sharon. It's always informative to listen to you. Thank you. I would like to ask Fatu the next question. So Fatu, we work together, so I really know a lot about you, more than our attendees. I know that you do self-identify as being autistic. And I also know how much you contribute to research and innovation. So I was wondering if you had any tips to share for researchers who might want to benefit from a neurodiverse team.
Yeah, I think that Sharon touched upon this a bit, but I think flexibility is quite important because neurodiverse people are very different and very diverse. And sometimes, for me specifically, working under rigid structures, crowded office settings, loud settings, it can be overwhelming, and it can really stifle your creativity, your sense of flexibility. So I think having a work environment that is flexible and not imposing any strict work hours or having the option to work from home in an environment that is adapted to our needs is very beneficial to neurodiverse employees and can really enable them to be a lot more productive and very creative. And also I would say in terms of communications, be clear and straightforward with your communications and your instructions. Avoid any ambiguity and vagueness, which can be overwhelming. I think being clear with your expectations as an employer will really enable you to benefit from the unique perspective that a neurodiverse workforce can bring to your environment. And also the whole concept of workplace culture, which is more and more common to try and seek employees that fit the culture, that are a culture fit. You don't really see it as much in research and academia, but it is very prominent in industry. And oftentimes what we see is that this culture isn't inclusive of people who have any differences in thinking or functioning. So trying to force neurodiverse people into this box can really be detrimental to their sense of well-being in the workplace, or even before that in the recruitment process. You are excluding this whole group of people just because you don't fit into your workplace. But I think that if you truly not loosen up, but place less importance on having your employee fitting into your workplace and really tap into what makes them different and unique and how that can be beneficial to your workplace, then I think that you will really benefit from the contributions of neurodiverse people who will be a lot more receptive to pitching ideas and taking leadership and ownership over their work.
Thank you, Fatu, for this insight. Laura, I would like to ask you the next question. So we know and we appreciate that Microsoft is a global leader in terms of inclusive hiring. And I know that you have personally contributed to these programs. So I would like to ask you if you could please share with us some lessons that Microsoft and yourself have learned about inclusive hiring, especially in terms of making the hiring process more accessible and inclusive.
Certainly, thank you for the time. So I am definitely honored to be here to speak to you about some of the work that Microsoft has done. And as mentioned, I was able to help with our Canadian, it was called our autism hiring event at the time, but it's now our neurodiversity hiring program. And so what we learned from this program is we wanted to start to look at our talent pools and to say, we believe that there is a significant population for our engineering positions that is untapped. And this is for anybody who would self-identify as having autism or be on the spectrum. And so what we did was we wanted to take a look at how can we attract this talent pool. And so some of the things we learned starting in the process, and I'll speak to a few different parts of our kind of hiring and interview process, was looking at our job descriptions. And so starting at our job descriptions to see how many requirements and qualifications were actually required for the job and how many were just nice to have. And so understanding that, and I think Sharon or somebody was speaking to it at the beginning about how people self-select out before they even apply. And so, taking a look at our 10 bullets that we had for requirements and seeing that actually maybe only 3 of them were requirements. And when we looked at educational criteria, we looked at identifying things such as, was a bachelor in commerce or a bachelor in computer science or mathematics actually required? Or could we look at some additional training that somebody took, say from a coding academy, that would also be equivalent? And so really starting there, so we had some big aha moments on our job descriptions. Then the second thing that we did differently is how we actually set up the interview day. And so typically for a technical interview at Microsoft, you would have a series of interviews, and you are say from probably 4 to 6 interviews that were 1 hour back to back. And during that time, you would meet with a different person, potentially from the team, and they would ask questions, you would whiteboard and code different activities. And so what we decided to do for this program, and we had piloted and learned from our Microsoft Redmond offices, was we actually made this hiring event over 3 days. And so that was quite different, obviously, for us in terms of how we typically look at interviewing this talent. And so the intention behind the 3-day hiring program was the first day was to invite the candidates in. So these are the candidates that have now applied, that had passed our first technical screens, and we wanted them to come in and get a sense of what did our workplace look like. Microsoft has moved to a very much an open concept office. And so we wanted to give people a tour of the office. This is the environment that you will be working in. This is how the teams collaborate. While we're open, we also have a lot of focus rooms and meeting rooms. So the first day was really understand the company, who we are, understand kind of our focus on inclusion, get to see the office. And then we actually had the hiring teams that were hiring come in and give an overview of their team. And so the candidates were able to get a sense of what exactly is that would I be working on, or what is the technology that I would be working on. We also did a few activities throughout the day to just start to see people's personalities come out. And while it may seem a little bit, when we kind of talk about team building, we were like, is this going to land well? As there are some people that could be introverted. But it was interesting to start to watch the candidates and anyone who had some of the kind of the natural leadership abilities start to come out in their own ways. And so we were able to get that on day one. The second day, what we did was we then set up what was called mock interviews or practice interviews. And so we started the beginning of the day with any kind of questions or tips that these candidates had. And then we set up, like I said, mock interviews with interviewers that were not part of the hiring teams. And the intention behind that was also to curb some of the nerves that come for anybody interviewing, let alone somebody who had identified and applied into this program. And so they went through different coding exercises, came back in, and then we did a debrief with a second group of managers. So again, not related to the teams that they would be hiring on, where they were able to ask their questions and say, hey, I really got stumped on this part on the whiteboarding activity. What would you recommend? And so it was interesting, the learnings for even for the managers that were present with them to say, ask questions. Like, you're absolutely allowed to ask questions as we're going through this interview. It's not supposed to be us watching you struggle on a whiteboard. It's tell me where you got, or tell me your logic, and I'll help you work through that. And so we had a great kind of debrief, and the candidates were feeling a little bit more comfortable then entering into the third day. And so the third day was where they were actually interviewing with the teams that were hiring. And so they had these prep interviews, they'd had some debriefs, and then they moved forward. And what we found with those was we had briefed some of the hiring managers to say nerves are going to be showing up in these interviews, and start to kind of really notice how the candidate is feeling. And if you need to adjust your strategy or your tactics for how you typically interview, please do that. And so I'll give you an example of a couple things that our hiring teams did that they now use them for interviewing all of their candidates. One of our hiring managers noticed that the individual was almost shutting down in the interview as they were struggling. And so he just said, you know what, I'm going to give you 5 minutes. Here's the problem that I need you to solve. I'm going to leave the room. Because in a real setting, you don't have somebody staring at you while you are trying to code a problem. You are able to ask your coworker, you are able to look up on a wiki. And so just stepping outside of the room and giving them the opportunity to think and pause and regroup was significant. We had another individual that again got super nervous. And so what the hiring manager did was said, let's go for a walk. We have a very large office. And so they walked around, had a glass of water, and just started to kind of talk. And again, probing on what is it that we were trying to achieve, and how are we trying to make our assessment. And so at the end of it, what was very interesting to see was how the hiring managers realized how they were typically interviewing before, how non-inclusive it was, and how it really could force anybody to shut down. And I think kind of our biggest learning from it that I would share is that we actually had a candidate who had come in and applied through our regular application process, which of course we say, if you require an accommodation, please let us know. I don't believe many candidates would ask for an accommodation for the interview process, as they might not know. But we had one candidate who went through the regular process, didn't receive an offer, then went through our neurodiverse hiring program over these 3 days, and all of the teams wanted this person. They were the top candidates. So amazing to see, same person, same skills, but really how we needed to deconstruct it to make it more inclusive and give them the opportunity to be successful. And so I think that's like ultimately our biggest aha and takeaway when we think about how do we hire differently. We then of course did a lot more work for like general readiness for our entire employee population, specific teams and managers, but that would be kind of my experience that I'm happy to share about how we interviewed differently.
Thank you, Laura. That was very informative. I would like to remind everybody that you can interact with us in the chat. I will monitor the chat and ask questions on your behalf to the panelists. So feel free to comment or ask questions in the chat in French or in English. I will ask, because there is nothing in the chat yet, so I will ask the next question. And I would like to go back to Sharon. And perhaps, Sharon, now that you have heard some top tips from Fatu and from Laura's experience at Microsoft, can you perhaps give us some ideas of how organizations could introduce these recommendations or tips into their own actions, practices, policies?
Yeah, and thank you both for all of that really fantastic insight. I'd say so I have these three segmented thematic areas that have, I think, emerged from both Fatu and Laura. But I will say first and foremost, something to bear in mind. One, chances are there are already neurodivergent folks in your workplace. But again, that process of self-identification and accommodation seeking is a very wrought theme and should be considered otherwise. So the idea of what do we do in order to attract talent should be more, what do we need to do as a baseline to begin? The second thing I also want to mention is often when you solve for, so exactly what Fatu and Laura mentioned, when you solve for, let's say, folks who are autistic or folks who have ADHD, you are definitely solving for them, but you are also solving for the most vulnerable people across the board. Because when you have a challenge, it is a challenge for everyone, but it is compounded when you are part of any marginalized group. So that being said, I noticed these three things that emerged from everything that Fatu said and also Laura validated, which is communications, flexibility, and fit. So in thinking about communications, Fatu said something very, very critical here, which is around non-ambiguity. We are fortunate enough on our team to do a lot of research alongside the work we do and alongside the people we work with. And one of the things that we've seen over and over again is something that comes hand in hand with inequity is ambiguity, especially in places that you would not even know. For instance, what we've learned from some small research samples that have emerged is that, for instance, with performance management, if your performance management systems, the ways of assessing people are unclear and ambiguous, this is going to be most detrimental for women, new immigrants, and neurodivergent folks. And that is because you are essentially asking someone to depend on cultural information and cultural norms within an in-group that they are not part of. And so they're having to go through this guessing game. And for, these three groups of people, and I imagine more, it becomes a huge barrier to being able to come with your full talents and skills, but also just a huge barrier to actually just, coming in the door. And so I think from an application point of view, it becomes really, really important to audit your existing ways around communication. What is clear, what is not clear, what is built into process, and what is assumed. I'll give you an example. Laura talked really excellently around the interview process. Something as simple as building it into a process. So not a matter of, individual decision by decision, but building it into process that when you are about to have an interview, send over your questions in advance. That's simple. That means that there is no ambiguity in what a person is coming in to that process into, letting them know what questions you're going to ask, who is going to be there, and what kind of what position they'll be playing should you be successful. So to say, like, Bob will be there, and they will be, if you are successful, they would be your immediate supervisor, things of that nature. Something that we've also implemented for clients in the past is one thing that I find really exciting, but a lot of people are terrified, is within the interview process, adding a portion that basically allows for a candidate to interview you. Again, we need to remember that a big part of equity is autonomy. And so the autonomy to make a decision about, is this the place I should be working? And even more importantly, for instance, if that re-interviewing is for them interviewing their direct, who would be their direct supervisor, understanding, does this person have the capacity and the empathy to be able to understand how I will need to work? You know, them being able to ask, how do you feel about something as simple even here as, when we are meeting, I never have my camera on. And if they say, oh, well, that's a sign of disinterest, I don't know if you're really listening, then that gives the person the autonomy to say, this is, regardless of all of the wonderful things they've mentioned about benefits and accommodation, this is maybe not the kind of place that I need to work. Or even make the decision, okay, I think although this person is not quite where they need to be, they are showing enough willingness to work with me. So perhaps this is a chance I can take. Again, autonomy. And there's flexibility and fit. And again, building that into process as much as possible. So you'd be able to say, like Fatu said, you know, we are building it into process that we have especially now, as we've seen in the last 3 years, have a more flexible remote work and also office work policies that, like Laura said, we have spaces both for co-working, but also for private work, that we have policies against scent, you know, not coming in with perfumes and things of that nature, ensuring that, for instance, if you're working in a physical office, something very simple as your soaps are not scented. The soaps that you buy for shared bathrooms are not scented, things of that nature. And again, that requires, and you know, this may come from us at QuakeLab, we use a lot of, like Virginie said, design thinking, systems thinking, and also results-based management, where a really, really good tool is journey mapping. Think of a person's journey from the moment they engage with you until, you know, some point that you decide, and just think about all of the ways in which they will need support or that they are faced with barriers. And consider this, like I mentioned at the top of my response, assume that there are neurodivergent folks in your workplace. And with that assumption, also assume that the fact that they're there means that they have had to navigate an incredible amount of barriers to be here. So do not think of that as we are where we need to be, but think about what are all of the barriers that they had to navigate to be here. Think of them as the sort of the ones who have been able to manage going through all of that, and that they do not need to. The next person doesn't need to have to go through these barriers. And what are the ways in which you can systemically and really intentionally solve for that, both identify them and solve for them? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm glad we are recording. I can listen to it again. Laura, if you don't mind, there are a few questions in the chat that are directed to you. So I would like to ask a few of these questions if we can. One that just came in is, I would like to know about resistances from Microsoft Teams to these adapted processes of hiring and the ways Microsoft HR teams have addressed them. You are describing a challenge that implies a change in organizational culture, and there is always resistances in a change process.
Certainly, yes. I'm happy to speak to that. And when we started to launch this program, we were getting questions from the business in terms of, well, how are these individuals going to show up? And should I be looking at them differently? And should I be treating them differently and assessing them differently? And we were saying, absolutely not. Regardless, we are assessing any hire for Microsoft needs to have the core capabilities to do the job. And that's what we're looking for. What we're going to learn out of this program is some people may need support and resources differently. And for example, I think Sharon used the perfect example of, there may be individuals that don't want to attend a stand-up meeting in the morning and speak when called on, but they will use a chat function to provide their questions and comments. And so it was really trying to level set to say, we are not looking for a different skill set. We are still looking for the qualifications that we need for a role. We are just looking at a a huge talent pool and a huge gap in our market that our job descriptions and our interview process is preventing us from even seeing these candidates. And so it didn't happen overnight. I would say it definitely, was a process and a journey, and about how do I evaluate them? What about performance reviews? What about, when it comes to promotions? And we were saying, we are core and common across talent, levels, and assessments. There's no difference here. What it is it may just be we're looking at some different accommodations for the individual, or they work differently than how somebody else on your team does. So definitely took some time.
And did you provide any training to the hiring committee or future supervisor regarding neurodiversity?
Yes, so we definitely did. We took, I would say, like a three-pronged approach for this. And so, I'd like to start by saying there is many organizations and companies that already have a large neurodiverse population that works for them that you are probably not even aware of, because people are not necessarily very comfortable coming forward and disclosing. And so we took kind of the first approach of, as Microsoft likes to pride ourselves on being a diverse and inclusive company, we wanted to do some overall kind of level setting for our entire population. And so we brought in a gentleman who is very well known in his research and his practice in this area, and his name was Dr. Warling. And so he came in and kind of gave a general overview and training to our site about autism and the workplace and some of the challenges and what employers can be doing and thinking about. And so that was a general training offered to every single person at our site to just get some knowledge and ask some questions. Then I would say, so following the general training sessions, the other things we did is obviously the teams that were hiring into this program, they were aware that candidates were coming through this specific program. So a little bit different than our general process where there could be a neurodiverse employee that's requested an accommodation. The hiring manager may not necessarily know what it was, but we were able to work with them to say, again, these are some things that might show up during the interview: nerves, shutting down, disengaging, perhaps wanting to leave early, or just being paralyzed and not able to speak. And so we kind of just said to them, take a different approach than you typically do. You shouldn't be in there to try to break them or to try to make sure that you can give them a problem that they're not able to solve. This is not what we're trying to get at here. So start thinking differently. So that was kind of what we did for the hiring managers. And then once we obviously had our candidates that were successful that we hired, we did a very small training and awareness with the immediate team these individuals will be working with. Like I said at the beginning, and I want to keep reminding, we were able to do this because the participants had applied into this program. They knew that they knew all these steps along the process, that we would be doing some education to their teams, where we said, you're going to have a new person that's starting on your team. And we had asked them, like, are there ways you work differently? Is there anything you would like us to cover with your team? To just say, hey, X employee is going to be starting in 2 weeks, and they might work differently than what you're used to seeing. And so if they don't, want to attend in-person stand-ups, but utilize the Teams function, that's going to be how they work. And so we would say, ask questions if you need to, but also let them share and disclose with you what they want. And then I would say the last thing that we did for training is we provided a few layers of support for both the new employees that were coming in as well as the manager. And so Microsoft has, and I'm sure as many other organizations do, various employee resource groups. And so we made sure that these employees were connected into our broader employee resource groups. We also provided them with a job coach, and the job coach specialized for people that were neurodiverse. And so they had a person that they were able to speak to that wasn't HR, that wasn't their manager, that wasn't directly giving them an assessment if they were unblocked, or to get them unblocked, or if they had questions about, hey, I'm really struggling with this with my manager, but I don't know how to bring it up. And so we provided a job coach to them and also to the managers as well, because this could be the first time some of the managers were managing employees that had different needs. And so I think kind of a combination of all three of those is what helped us make sure that the teams and the managers felt at least equipped to support these individuals. So hopefully that helped answer that question.
Yes, thank you. we won't have time to answer all the questions. There are questions, and I think both you, Sharon, and Laura could perhaps speak to that. It's the after the hiring, once the person starts working, and there are tensions between the workspace, how the person can be accommodated, how the team works together, and the needs of other employees or supervisors. How do we negotiate those tensions between an accommodation that is necessary or required and the needs of other employees or the workplace? And I will give you maybe 5 minutes for the two of you to address that question, because I want Fatu to answer the last question of this session. Thank you.
Sharon, do you want to go first?
Oh, yeah, I can go fairly quickly. Just to say that there's something about language around like equity, accessibility, accommodation that really scares people into this place of not kind of going through a thought process that is very organic, in the way that we often face scenarios in the workplace where we learn that something is not working for an individual and then go through a process of accommodating them. It can be something as simple as if you're in a meeting with someone and they say, oh, it's cold in here, and then you go through the process of, oh, do you want me to close the window? I think we can control the heat. Do you want a second to go get your coat? That is a process of accommodating someone's needs. And so just releasing yourself of this notion that there is some magical skill set or tool that is required in order to do that, sort of logical pathway of thinking, where you give space for a person to communicate what they need, build that trust in those pathways, provide a number of alternatives, again, really leaning on that idea of autonomy, provide alternative pathways, allow them to either select on those pathways or iterate on those pathways, and you make the decision of what resources do I need to be able to do that, and then, work through that collaboratively. And so when you break it down into something like it's cold in our meeting room, it feels a lot less tedious and a lot less like you're doing something that is completely outside of the norm. It is a thing we do consistently in the world, and we can just use that same application process. But I also wanted to caution a little bit here on this, something we see often, not just when talking about neurodiversity, but also in general in equity. There is a tendency to spend a lot of resources on building a person's ability to create an environment or work with someone who is, let's say, neurodivergent or Black or physically disabled, rather and not enough resources on ensuring that a person who is neurodivergent or Black or whatever has that space. And so I want to caution you on ensuring that when you look at the ways you're spending resources for the sake of inclusivity, for the sake of accessibility, that you really are putting the majority of your resources and ensuring that that person who you're working in service of is getting the bulk of the resources you have put aside to make a place inclusive. And so, for instance, if you're thinking about, I love what Laura mentioned around like what was provided. Yes, there was some training provided and some support provided to managers, but the bulk of that coaching, all of that was put towards focused towards the people you are working in service of. So just be mindful of that. It sounds, matter of fact now, but sometimes if you were to step back and let's say look at over the last 10 years or the last 5 years what your organization has spent, you might find, for instance, the bulk of that budget has been on, let's say, unconscious bias training, which if you really drive it down to it, that is spending on the most privileged rather than those who are most marginalized.
Thanks, Sharon. I will jump in and say some of the learnings that we took away kind of from the accommodations side was there's no kind of one size fits all approach for everybody. And so when we were doing some of our trainings, we would get questions from hiring managers or teams, or what are some types of accommodations that I should be looking at? And we very much lead with the kind of with the philosophy and the mantra at Microsoft of like, nothing about me without me, right? And so each individual is different. And so we shouldn't be trying to have them sitting in a quiet location where the lights are dim and there's no music because we think that's what they need. It was like, let's absolutely get to know them and ask them what they need. And what we found, the accommodations that we looked at were very simple things in the sense of noise canceling headphones. You know, I need these every day to be successful at work, no problem. We had another request for a weighted blanket due to kind of fidgeting. Again, that's very easy for us to look at, but we never, and like I said, I know everybody is different and their needs are different, but they were very small, simple things that we could provide easily, that somebody who's neurotypical, I would never think about noise canceling headphones or, you know, needing a weighted blanket. And so the other thing that we found that this population needed from us was not so much different ways of working, but also just clarity and knowing that they were doing a good job, knowing, like, for example, I'll give you an example. We have a probationary period at Microsoft, and understanding that this population who had, for us, that had struggled to kind of gain employment, were very much worried about, are they going to pass their probationary period? Where we were like, don't worry about that. You're doing a great job. But again, it was just, this is what some of them were focused on. And so again, just understanding their concerns and what they were worried about, we were able to handle a lot of that. And so, like I said, it's very much an individual, not one size fits approach. And we just asked them to keep us posted. If there's anything that came up, we also, if they weren't comfortable, their job coaches were able to come back and share with us. So minor things like that, but made a big difference.
Thank you very much. It's a nice transition to the last question I would like to ask Fatu. Nothing about us without us. Fatu, I think I would like you to perhaps give some tips to students who might self-identify as being neurodiverse. Because if we want them to access the workplace, then first they need to succeed in their academic journey. So Fatu, do you know if there are some tips you could share, some resources perhaps for students?
Yeah, I guess the main tip that I'm going to share, which is a very obvious one, is really schedule your time in blocks and make sure to schedule your breaks. It may sound obvious, but it does make a world of a difference. And sometimes for neurodiverse people, it can be easy to fall off the train of scheduling and staying organized. But research moves really fast, academia moves really fast, and you'll often be juggling multiple things at once. So it can be easy to get overwhelmed very fast. And also for some people who get hyper-focused on tasks, really schedule your breaks, set an alarm so that you know you don't forget to eat. Because when your brain is always running 100 kilometers an hour and you're excited about what you're doing and you just want to go, then it's super easy to just get lost and lose a whole day in work. And then you realize I haven't done anything for myself, my wellness, which can lead to burnout, and burnout can come at you really fast. So really being cognizant of the way that you are spending your time. And even if you are enjoying the work that you're doing, your school, don't spend your entire time doing that one thing. Take time for yourself, take breaks, and socialize as well. And I think on the other thing that Laura touched on, don't be afraid to ask for those little accommodations. Sometimes it can be scary, but your workplace and your school is there to help you. So if you do need canceling headphones or a warm light to be able to work properly, then ask for it. There's no harm in asking for it. And the worst thing that can happen is that you're told no, but likely you won't be told no. And I think really share your ideas, take initiative and leadership. Your ideas are it's valid, they're great. You can bring ideas that are very different than someone that is neurotypical, just because the way you're thinking is different. And that can be a great thing and really beneficial to research in academia. So really, yeah, share your ideas and make sure that you're taking time for yourself.
Thank you very much. We have 3 minutes left, so we will pause here, although we could continue for hours. This conversation was extremely informative, and I see from the chat that I'm not the only one thinking that way. So thank you very much to Laura, Sharon, Fatu. We will pause here, but you have in the chat the LinkedIn or Twitter contacts for the 4 of us. So if you want to get in touch, you have ways of communicating with us. We can stick around for the few minutes that we have left if there are any burning questions that you would like to ask. But thank you very much to everybody for being here, and feel free to get in touch. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Laura as well. It was a true pleasure to have you here.